Okay, last time I think we stopped here, correct? This is our last thing we discussed. This is essentially the purpose of the temple. Now all of this is coming from Solomon before they actually build the temple. Remember, this is all temple preparations. And he says it's a place for the name of the Lord to be. That means the presence of God. And for a place of offering, to make offerings. So you offer incense, bread, also blood sacrifice of burnt offerings in the morning and evening, Sabbath, new moons, and appointed festivals, which means daily, weekly, monthly, and annual. There's 3 big annual festivals. Okay? So that's one of the great purposes. Now, that's not necessarily the only purpose, but they're describing what, why do we do this? What are we doing? And it's a place to worship God and offer sacrifices and so forth. Now, the last thing that David did was gather together a bunch of craftsmen, not actually gathering them, but kind of organizing and preparing the craftsmen. And this is described in those verses. But they talk about Huram Abi, which becomes in Masonic traditions Hiram Abif. But this is a person who is a Israelite mother and a Canaanite or Tyrian, that means from the city of Tyre, father. And he's a craftsman, okay? And he can work gold, all these different materials, fabrics, so he's a great artist. They find the greatest artists they can find, and they essentially assign them, that is, he gets hired by David to work on the temple. So it's kind of like going to find Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I mean, you look around for the best artist of the area, you find this guy, and he is assigned to do it. But it's interesting, he's half Canaanite and half Israelite, this particular fellow. Okay, so that's basically the preparations that David did. Now we also have to look at specifically what happened when they built the temple. And here we're looking at what are called building narratives, where they describe the building of the temple, and in the process describe what it looked like, and then describe kind of what it was for, and so forth. So these narratives are divided into 2 parts. Here's where you find them in the Bible. One part is building the temple, the other part is describing the furnishings of the temple. So there's a big long section there in the Old Testament. Hopefully you read it in preparation for the class. Now, the building narratives are organized into, the first part is they describe the building, then they describe the furnishings, then they describe the dedication of the temple, which is a lengthy description of what they did, including the bringing of the ark into the temple, offering a sacrifice and prayer, and who does the actual dedication of the temple. Solomon himself. So notice, it's not the high priest that does it, but it's the king. And this is part of ancient Israelite tradition, that sometimes you'll see kings performing priestly functions. High priest in this particular case. And then finally these stories conclude with a theophany, that is to say, God manifests himself at the temple. So those are the elements of these building narratives. The description of how they built the temple, how they furnished the temple, then the dedication ceremony that they undertook, and then the manifestation of God, which means God accepts the temple and he appears there, and his appearance means the temple is accepted, now God will dwell there, things like that. Now, in terms of the geography, remember we talked about Old Jerusalem. Bronze Age Jerusalem extended up till about here, and then they extended the city up, building houses in part of it, but the temple complex at the top of this ridge. So you've got this ridge here. The original city is built in the lower part because of the access to the water supply, but they're extending it up the ridge, and on the very top, the highest point, is where they built the temple. And in this, they build a complex, actually not just the temple, but they build the temple, a palace, and a royal court place where they can have business. They call it the Forest of Lebanon and so forth. Okay? Now, a little bit of archaeology survives from this, but very little. They just discovered some city walls and a gate about right here that you can go see today, but most of it's long gone. Why are the remains of these 3,000 years old buildings gone? Because people take the stones when the building falls apart and gets disused. They drag the stones off and reuse them. So, the stones may be there somewhere in the city, but there's no way to track them down. They're gone. Okay, what we're going to do now is just take a look at the structure of the temple as described in these chapters. So you've got Solomon's temple. It includes an altar out front, a water basin for storing water, smaller basins where they took water out of this basin and put them into the smaller ones and can push them around to, what's this water for? Cleaning up, right? And then they have small little chambers around the sides, and then a huge chamber and a smaller chamber, which is the Holy of Holies. This is called the Holy Place. This is called the porch, or the Olam, and it's got 2 giant bronze pillars there, and then a courtyard out in front. So that's the basic structure. We'll go through now and take a look at each little part, and we are going through in this description in the order that you find them in the biblical narratives. And what they start with is essentially a description as if you were walking into the temple. And this part is called the Olam. It means the porch or the vestibule, and it means a little kind of an entryway. You could call it a monumental gate. There's a giant, gateway here, ornamented with these 2 bronze pillars, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, beyond that, there appeared to have been wooden doors plated with gold, but also a veil or a curtain that they don't put over it. So they had kind of 2 barriers. You could open and close the doors and lock it up, but you could also have a curtain there, so when the doors were open, people couldn't see in necessarily. Okay? The porch then is in front, and around the sides are these small chambers. You could not enter into these small chambers from inside the temple. You had to do it from outside the temple. Remember when we showed you pictures of Egyptian temples, they had these same type of chambers around the Holy of Holies, but they had access only from the inside. Solomon's side chambers had access only from the outside. And what were these rooms for? There's a whole bunch of them. There's maybe 20 or 30 of them. What are they for? They stored supplies. They stored temple treasure, maybe a library, kept books. They kept clothing for the priest, the utensils that they needed to do the sacrifices. You need knives, you need basins to pour the oil and the water out of, incense holders, all sorts of stuff. So they'd store all the supplies, as well as treasures, which are things given to the temple, money and so forth. And then also probably books were kept in these side chambers. And some of them maybe were used for changing clothes and different things like that. Now, when the next thing in the story is about the covenant. So what you do is you get this narrative, and then they interject ideological or theological statements. And as Solomon is building the house, the Lord sets up this covenant situation with him. And that's one of the key things about ancient temples, is that they are associated with covenant making. You build the temple as a place to make the covenant, and the temple is also a sign or a symbol of the covenants that you make. And then you keep the covenants inside the temple. Does that make sense? Anyway, this is what the Lord says to Solomon in these verses. Concerning this house that you're building, if you will, and then he lines up 3 things you're supposed to do. Walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, keep all my commandments by walking in them. So walking is a symbol here for doing something, obeying. Anyway, what's walk in my statutes? These are the laws, the commandments, like the 10 Commandments or whatever, that have been given in the law, or the Torah as the Jews call it, to Moses on Mount Sinai. What are the ordinances? These are the rituals, the temple rituals that they're supposed to perform, the sacrifice, all these different things that are outlined. So it's kind of part of the statute, but these are more like ethical commands. Don't steal, don't commit adultery. These are more ritual commands. And then keep my commandments. So what's the difference between the statutes and commandments? These would be things that the prophets give on a particular basis. So there's kind of a law that's eternal, that everybody's supposed to follow, but the prophet comes in and says, in this particular situation you need to do this. So those are commandments from the Lord for a specific purpose or situation. Okay? So a lot of what our prophets give us in conference are specific things for right now, right? 50 years from now that might not be applicable, like, don't do drugs. Maybe 50 years from now, drugs will be eliminated, so, it's not an issue anymore. Just as Slavery used to be an issue. It's not an issue anymore. You know, these types of things. But they are very important for right now. Okay, so if you'll do those things, that is, this is the Israelite side of the covenant, then what will God do? This is God's side of the covenant. I will establish my promise with you, or my covenant with you, which I made to your father David. So notice, David received a covenant, but it has to be reestablished with Solomon as well. Okay? And the covenant is, I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. So God will dwell with them. That's the purpose of the temple, is have a place where God can dwell. And that's his promise. He'll be with the people. And of course this becomes even more fully fulfilled when Christ comes, right? Because he literally dwells with the people. And so that's the covenant that's made, and Solomon then essentially accepts that covenant and finishes the house, the temple. When you see the term house in this context, it means the house of the Lord, and that means literally this is the place where God lives, right? Like my house is where I live, your house is where you live, God's house is where he lives. So it's the house of the Lord is God's dwelling place. And that's why he says he'll dwell in the midst there. Okay. So, the narrative begins with describing kind of the outer parts of the temple, and then the covenant is made, and then you're permitted to go inside to the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Does that make sense? So they're kind of doing the outside stuff, make the covenant at the gateway, then you go in. And in the inside here, then you have, essentially, it's described in some detail, but there's stone walls with some wooden beams in them, and then inside they've paneled the entire room with cedar wood, and then that cedar wood is covered with gold. So the entire room is gold. It would actually be kind of annoying if you think about it. You know, there's color in the sense that they have veils, curtains there that are of colored fabric, but everything's gold. It would get, you know, kind of overwhelming. But anyway, that's how they describe it. Cedar wood, panels with gold plate, or probably fairly thin gold foil put on top of it. Yeah, you had a comment?
Was there, like, after they into the temple once and made those covenants, was there purpose of going back to just renew those covenants?
Well, the priest, the high priest, actually makes the covenant on behalf of Israel. The Israelites don't go in themselves. Only priests can go inside the temple. So the priests will go in and do the rituals, and they will come out and they will read the law to the people, and the people then accept the covenant. And they renewed it every year. They had at the Day of Atonement, the law was read, people accepted it, you know, in vocal proclamation. Okay? So in here then you've got a big chamber. And it's paneled with carvings of cherubs and palm trees. It's got menorah in them. These are these golden lampstands. It's got a table. This was to provide light. Okay, it says there were 10 in Solomon's temple, and they were simply oil lamps with that provided light. So it'd actually be pretty dim. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen an oil lamp. It doesn't provide that much light. And so you need a bunch, but even so, it would be pretty dark, pretty dim in there. Then you had a table with showbread on it and an altar for offering incense. Apparently there's a stairway here, it's not clear. And then another door, set of wooden doors with a veil, and then you would go on into the Holy of Holies at that point. Now the Holy of Holies is described as the Dabir, which means the oracle, sometimes. And sometimes it's called Holy of Holies, which is Kodesh HaKodeshim, which means the holiest. That's the Hebrew way to say the most holy, is to say the Holy of Holies. So the most holy place. And in it were also pictures of palm trees and cherubs, and there were 2 giant cherub statues, and then the Ark of the Covenant rested between those statues. And they had 10 cubit wingspans, it says. I mean, these were huge, big statues, several times bigger than a human. Okay? So that's, I mean, we're just going through the description you find in the Book of Kings. That's what they talk about. Who was allowed to go in this room? Only the high priest, right. Now, maybe other people went in sometimes, but in a ritual sense, the high priest was the guy who went in there and then performed the rituals. They also describe the doors, and the Kings mentions only wooden doors, plated with gold and carved with cherubs and palm trees. That's why cherubs and palm trees? Everything. Every room is described as having carvings on the walls of cherubs and palm trees. Why? Yeah.
They're like representative of the Garden of Eden.
Exactly. The Garden of Eden is a place where there's lots of trees, and the cherubs are protecting their, angelic beings or whatever, who are protecting, guarding the Garden of Eden. So it means that this is a Edenic state. Because, of course, God dwells in the Garden of Eden and God dwells in the temple. So, anyway, there's doors described in Kings, and Chronicles adds that there was a veil, which seems to be the case. The doors could be opened and closed, but the veil when the doors were open, the veil could kind of prevent people from watching and, annoying the priests and stuff like that. Then it describes that the building was completed, and it says it took 7 years to build the building, which is probably an intentional number of years because they want it to parallel the time of creation. There's 7 days of creation, 7 years of the temple building. So all of this is symbolic. Then the narrative goes on to describe the courts around the temple and the palace complex. The temple itself was only part of what Solomon built. He also built this giant palace for himself and a palace attached to this for Pharaoh's daughter. And then he built a giant thing called the House of the Forest of Lebanon, because all of the pillars were of cedar wood. And then a throne room. So this was essentially administrative offices and a place where he could meet the court and have councils and stuff like this. This was the private palace of the king. And then this was the temple. Okay? So it was a big complex, and in fact, the palace of the king took longer. It was bigger than the temple and took longer. So Solomon's house was bigger than God's house, which is kind of an interesting thing to do. Then they go into detailed narrative about these pillars. They were apparently very cool and very important. However, they never tell us what they mean. They just describe them. And they're described as being pieces of bronze. They're huge. I think they're 30 cubits high. I can't remember. And then they are cast. You know how hard that would be to do? What is casting bronze? Yeah? Yeah, you liquefy it. You have to melt it down and then pour it in a mold. And to make this a single piece of cast bronze would be extremely complicated. I mean, this is a monumental achievement. Apparently they were hollow. I mean, there's different ways that they did this, and they may have made it in several pieces, like the main thing one piece and the capitals a different piece, and then bolted them together. But at any rate, there were these huge bronze pillars. They had kind of floral motifs here, meaning they represented trees, and they are we've talked about these. These are markers of sacred space. You pass through these pillars, you are passing into sacred space. Okay. And then they give them names, Yachin and Boaz, which means something like, strength and foundation or something along those lines. They're not really quite Hebrew words, but they sound, they sound kind of like the meaning of those words. Okay, yes?
So do these pillars derive from the fertility god Asherah?
Well, not necessarily. Asherah was generally worshipped with a tree and wooden pillars. So these are bronze. However, the symbolism of sacred trees is found in both Israelite and Canaanite religion, but the meaning they apply to it and what they use them for are different. So, it overlaps probably, but it's not exactly the same thing. Somebody else had a hand up?
So like the forest of Lebanon, would those be for Asherah then?
Well, if you were a Canaanite and you carved a picture of Asherah on it, then it would be an Asherah tree. If you didn't, it wouldn't. So that's why it's ambiguous, and that's why a lot of the Israelites don't quite know whether to do it or not. You know what I'm saying? It's confusing to them. It's like if you have a cross in your church, does that mean you're a Catholic or a Baptist? Well, Baptists have crosses. Catholics have crucifixes. Baptists tend not to have crucifixes. That is a image of Christ nailed to the cross as a crucifix, as opposed to a cross. So there's ambiguities and overlap in these things. Yes.
I was just thinking from like an LDS perspective, are these temples really the temple of God, like our temple of God?
Well, they are, but they didn't necessarily do exactly the things we do in there. They're kind of, you got to understand, these are Aaronic temples. They're not based on Melchizedek priesthood, and so they're more like the sacrament tends to be something that's more like what they did in these temples, but there's an overlap. So, I mean, what I would say is Israelite temples like this, LDS temples like this, we do some things that we don't find described here. There's a lot of things that overlaps, and then there's some things like blood sacrifice we don't do, but we symbolically have the sacrament as a substitutionary blood sacrifice, right? I mean, it represents the blood and the flesh. So, yeah, there's clear overlap, but also some differences. Yep.
Would it have been a lot like Kirtland was?
Somewhat more like Kirtland, but Kirtland also had an assembly hall in the temple, which we actually still have assembly halls in temples, but we don't use them. They would have used it much more on a regular basis. They, would have regular church meetings in there as well. So, yeah, these things are interlocking and overlapping, but still not exactly the same. They had a courtyard with a big altar. What's the purpose of this altar? This is where they burn the burnt offering. So when you slaughter an animal, if you were going to do a sacrifice, you'd bring in the animal, you'd slit its throat. You'd hang it up and let the blood drain out, then you'd butcher it, and you would take the meat, and you would give a portion to the Lord, which is taken and burnt on this altar. And literally burnt to ashes, okay? Then you'd give a portion to the priests, and they would take that and eat that, and that's how they got, that was essentially their pay, how they got their food to eat. And then the person who offered the sacrifice would take a portion home with them, and they would eat that. So the meat was not completely burnt, except on a couple of, one particular type of offering called the burnt offering, in which the whole animal was burnt completely. And that was done once in the morning and once in the evening, some other times as well. But mostly, only a portion of the sacrifice was burnt. Okay? And this was a huge altar that you could walk up on. We've actually have some examples of these that survive from antiquity. And they had it would be kind of like a bonfire up there. This wasn't a little teeny fire. This was a big bonfire. They also had what is called the brazen sea out in the courtyard. This was described as being a huge basin filled with water and resting on the back of 12 oxen. Now this, of course, we use that symbol in our baptisms for the dead in temples. Most of you have probably done that. But what's the purpose of this basin of water? What?
Washing.
Yeah, apparently the priests did immersions. They had to immerse themselves as a purification ritual to prepare to do the sacrifices. So they would immerse themselves in the water. And it's not clear if they did it in this basin or they took the water out of the basin to do it. But at any rate, it was used for purifications. And then they'd also take the water from here and put them in these small basins and push them around. These are essentially just buckets to move the water around. And then they would clean up the temple, because when you have that many animals being sacrificed, you've got blood and guts. I mean, it's kind of a mess. So you got to keep the thing clean, and they're constantly the Levites are constantly cleaning things. So this was a purification basin. It later becomes what's called a mikvah in Hebrew, which is a pool designed for immersion. We'll talk about these more later. But they are purification pools where you immerse yourself to purify yourself. And we'll describe some of that a little bit later. Did I see another hand? Yes?
Yeah, so would you say these immersions could act as a prelude to a ritual baptism? They had the Aaronic priesthood.
What's that?
They had the Aaronic priesthood.
Right. Well, baptism is a immersion purification ritual, right? Exactly. I mean, it derives from this temple purification ritual. There's some differences in that in these immersions, they immerse themselves. And in baptism, somebody baptizes you. So they're a little bit different, but they're nonetheless closely connected together. Yeah?
Well, like the Israelites, they were aware of baptism too, even if they didn't practice it. Right?
Well, for them, clearly they're doing this type of immersion all the time, yes. It goes back way, you find it described in the book of Moses, or not book of Moses, but the books of Moses, Leviticus and so forth. Okay, here's a close-up of these basins that they push the water around in. And again, we're not going to read these passages, but you can go find them. I've put the parallel passages in Chronicles and Kings where you can find those, the descriptions. But they're described as having bowls and cherubs and palm trees and stuff on the panels here, and then wheels that they, could kind of push these around. They're obviously not great, they're not designed to move well and far. They're just designed to move these basins of water around within the courtyard. So they're not really wagons or carts or something, but they're kind of like that. Now, this is a medieval 14th century Jewish depiction of some of the what you could call the vessels of the temple. Here you can see the menorah, this 7-branch candlestick, which is still a famous Jewish symbol. You've got little vessels to pour wine out of, or maybe to carry water around in. You've got horns that you needed to blow. Here's the Ark of the Covenant. Here's the table with the showbread on it. The Bible goes into detail describing all these different pieces of furniture. They had big forks that they would push stick the meat with and kind of pull it around and stuff, like you have on a barbecue, only these were big ones apparently, to move a whole animal carcass and things like that. Temple vessel, here's a medieval or a 5th century AD depiction of the showbread table. You can see the bread on it, but you can also see vessels of wine. So this big table they had the bread set out on also had wine. So, we today we don't do blood sacrifice, but we do bread and wine sacrifice, or offering rather, right? And that is based on what was done in the holy place. So the blood sacrifice was done in the courtyard. In the holy place, you would have vessels to contain wine and bread, and you'd have them on tables, and these were offerings to God. And then after every week, they would eat that bread and drink the wine themselves. So it's a shared meal with God. When you come to the sacrament, that's what it is, right? God is there as Jesus, and he shares a meal with the people. The meal is bread and wine. Well, that is drawing straight back to the meal of bread and wine offered in the holy place of the ancient temple. Does that make sense? See what I'm talking about? So once they got all this ready, they had to build all the furniture, all the vessels. These were very costly. There were many made out of gold. Another thing to note is that everything outside the temple, in the courtyards outside, was made of bronze. The pillars, the basins, the brazen sea, the altar, all made out of bronze. When you get into the temple, everything's made out of gold. So anything you have to take into the temple has to be made out of gold. A vessel, a menorah, a table, whatever it is. Okay? Now, once all this is done, they install the Ark of the Covenant. Where did that Ark of the Covenant come from? King David had it. Well, originally it was built in the days of Moses by Bezalel, right? He makes all this furnishings for the temple, and he makes the Ark of the Covenant. Moses got instructions from God, gives them to Bezalel. He's the craftsman, he makes it. They carry it around with them in the wilderness, and when they come into Israel, it's set up and it's moved around to several different shrines. It's actually briefly captured by the Philistines, which was a huge scandal, right, that the enemies of God could capture it. But it ends up, they put it in somebody's house just to keep it there in Kiryat Yarim, and then David takes it and puts it in his palace complex, awaiting the building of the temple. And so from there it is taken from the city of David, that is Zion. Zion means the fortress or the strong place. So the city of David here is another name for that is Zion, and that just means Old Jerusalem. Okay, they brought it there where David had moved it, and they have a huge procession. And all the people come along, they offer many, many sacrifices, and they carry it up, the priests carry it up and put it in the Holy of Holies. They drew out the staves that were at the end. What that means is, you've got a box like this, right, that contains in it the Ark of the tablets of the covenant and so forth. And they had these poles, right, and they'd carry it on their shoulders. And so when they put it in the holy place, or the Holy of Holies, the edges of the poles stuck out so that you could kind of see them sticking into the holy place. Okay? Does that make sense? So the poles, What that means is, if this is the Holy of Holies, they install the ark, the poles go this way, not this way, because they kind of poked out a little bit beyond. And, I mean, that's what they're talking about. Just the direction, the angling of the poles, the staves that they carried it on. Is that clear to everybody? Now, when that happens, the culmination of this is that the presence of God comes to the temple, and it's manifest as what's called a cloud theophany. Cloud theophany means when God appears, but he's hidden within a cloud. You know what I'm saying? So there's kind of a big cloud that comes, and God is there, and it's filled with light. It's kind of like lightning storm, where lightning is flashing in a cloud or something like that. That's kind of how they describe it. And so what we're approaching now is the coming of the presence of God. Once the ark is installed, God's presence is going to come to the temple. What's the most famous cloud theophany we know of? In the New Testament, what happens? In the Transfiguration, God appears in a cloud, right? And Christ enters the cloud, but the apostles who are watching this, they're outside the cloud. So that's a cloud theophany, when God is kind of masked by this cloud. Anyway, that's what's going to happen now. So what happens is they put the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, and then the priests sanctify themselves again, which means immersing in water, changing their clothing, getting anointed with oil, things like that. And then they got all the singers together. Remember, we talked about the Levites having a choir. And they have cymbals and harps and lyres. These are musicians. And they have trumpeters. And they have all these guys singing. And they're all dressed in fine linen, which means what? This is a fabric made out of flax. It's very white, bright, kind of shiny and shimmery. It's a form of cloth, right? But it means white. They're dressed in white robes. I mean, that's made out of this linen fabric. Okay? So the whole choir, all the Levites are gathered together. There's 120 trumpeters, so this is a huge crowd of people. It was the duty of the trumpeters and singers to sing in unison. They sang praise to the Lord. What were they singing? Probably some of the Psalms. Their Psalms are lots of different songs, but many of them are temple hymns. That is, things that the Levites sang in the temple. So you can get a good idea of some of the temple ideology by reading the Psalms and trying to picture what they're doing this. But one of the things they sing is, "For the Lord is good, his steadfast love endures forever." These Psalms, many Psalms have that particular phrase in it. Okay? So, we realize that these were sung in the temple. Then the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, and the priests could not stand to minister because of the glory of the Lord. And so they kind of run away. So there's this cloud overcomes the temple, and it's filled with bright, shining light. The glory of the Lord kind of means the power of the Lord, the presence of the Lord, the bright light that manifests itself. And the priests couldn't perform their functions. They kind of withdrew. They were overwhelmed by this. Okay? So, and what does that represent? That's the coming of God. God is in the cloud. Remember, when Israel is in the wilderness, what happens to... how does God manifest himself as they're wandering around the wilderness? A pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day, right? And it hovers over the temple and kind of guides them. That's actually the same thing. It's not... We think of it as two different things, but it's a cloud filled with light, right? The cloud, you can see the cloud in the day, but you can't see the light so well because it's bright sunny. But at night you see the light better than you see the cloud. Does that make sense? So it's one thing. It's the glory of God is the light that's in the cloud. The cloud is covering God. So it's God's presence. And that comes into the temple. And so what that means is now God is not wandering around with Israel. Now he has come in and he's settled down, and that's his permanent place. So it's the coming, it's the presence of God manifest in the temple. We have kind of the same type of things in some of the descriptions of the Kirtland, the dedication of the Kirtland temple. I don't know if you, and it's 109, 110 in Doctrine and Covenants. If you go read those passages, you'll see, and then read some of the accounts of the people who were there. You can get a sense of that type of thing. Okay. Those are the temple narratives. Hopefully you get a sense of the symbolism of what they're doing and things like that. Any questions on that? We'll discuss more of what went on later on when we look at Herod's temple and how it was similar to and different from Solomon's temple. But that's another thing we can talk about a little bit later. So, any questions? So, what happens to the glory of God that appears in the temple there? The glory of God stays in the temple, but can it leave? Yeah, sometimes it leaves. Does it ever leave permanently? Yeah, what you see then is you have this narrative of the history of Israel, and then at the end, in the time of Zedekiah, in the time of Lehi, there's a prophet named Ezekiel who has been taken captive into Babylon, and he has a vision of the glory of the Lord leaving the temple. It goes out the gate, goes up onto the top of Mount of Olives, and then it ascends into heaven, and it's gone. And once the glory of God has left the temple, it is desacralized. And what happens to it? Within a few years, it's completely destroyed. So the departure of that glory, which Ezekiel describes, is the end of the glory comes in at the time of Solomon, and then it departs at the time of Ezekiel, and then the temple's destroyed. As long as the glory's there, temple's safe, but when God departs, it's just a building.